Hey everyone, Eric Rainey here, and welcome to the 60th episode of the Writ podcast. So, on the weekend, Pierre Poilievre won the Conservative leadership race pretty emphatically with a huge victory over Jean Charest. And the first couple of days have been, let's say, a little bit interesting for the new Conservative leader. He's had some issues that we'll talk about. There's been new announcements from the federal government in terms of their inflation package, which is something that Poilievre went after the government for a long time. So there's lots to talk about in just these first few days of the Poilievre leadership. So joining me to talk to me is the CBC's Aaron Rayes, Shannon Proudfoot of the Globe and Mail, and Supriya Director of Policy and Engagement at the Centre for Media, Technology and Democracy and Senior Counsel for Enterprise Canada. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So it is Thursday morning. It's been a quickly developing story, so who knows what happens the rest of today, people who are listening. But it's been, a interesting few days. So Poilievre wins the Conservative leadership in a big way, a big number that I don't think a lot of people were expecting, particularly just to smash his rival so much. It's been a few days now, so I don't know if we need to still go over the actual results. I'd instead like to talk about the first few days of his leadership. So he comes out with his new leadership team. He has Alain Rayes, who is a pretty well-known Quebec Conservative MP who decides to step aside and leave the caucus over charges that Poilievre's politics are toxic and he wants a more respectful kind of politics. So he leaves caucus. Then we get news that there are text messages that are sent to members within his riding, more or less inviting them to flood his phone lines and tell him that they're upset that he left the caucus. The Conservative Party, late on Wednesday night, then apologized for that, which is something that I'm not sure that a lot of us were expecting. So it's been a weird few days. Aaron, I'll start with you. How do you think it's going for Pierre Poilievre in his first few days as leader?
I think it was going actually quite well up until he showed up for a news conference, or I guess to deliver remarks. With the sort of caveat that he wasn't going to take any questions, because that led to David Akin, our colleague from Global, yelling questions at him. And I think that is when Poilievre started to sort of lose the thread he'd started to try to lay down at, after winning the leadership. He wins the leadership and he gives this speech and he doesn't talk about the World Economic Forum. He doesn't talk about Bitcoin. He sands off a lot of the edges that he'd shown during the leadership campaign. And if you had never seen Poilievre before that speech, you're probably thinking, well, this guy isn't, the extreme combative partisan that I've heard about. And then he starts getting heckled or yelled at by David Akin, and he calls him a liberal heckler. And I thought that was kind of when the mask slipped a bit. And then Reyes quits and suddenly the party's sending out text messages calling on him to resign. And in the same, when he does take questions, he attacks Reyes. And I think he, this kind of exemplifies the challenge Poilievre's going to have if he plans on either, having sort of dueling personas or sending different messages to different audiences. Or if he's planning on trying to kind of leave the edginess behind, because his reflex and the reflex of the people around him is to be combative and to call journalists liberal hecklers, and to then fundraise off of those conflicts. And so I think that this week kind of laid bare the sort of central challenge he has as he tries to appeal beyond the Conservative Party. And trying to figure out what his persona is going to be.
Those of us who either still are or used to be in the gallery, I don't think we would say that David Akin is a liberal, so it was a little bit of an odd thing to hear. Supriya, the first few days after his victory, it was all about how much he had won. He had done so well. This looks like it's going to be, a really tough opponent, really good on the message discipline. I don't know. Do you feel like that is still the narrative right now?
No, I don't think so. And just to touch on, Aaron's point, like I made this sort of similar point on my own podcast seriously yesterday, where it was like he had these great first couple of days, right? His acceptance speech was amazing. To have a politician, particularly a conservative politician, talk about housing in a way where, he's acknowledging how hard it is for younger folks how we need to incentivize more housing around transit stations in particular, so that younger folks won't then need to also, pour money into a car to get from point A to point B, I thought was particularly refreshing. He goes to introduce himself to his caucus. He has his adorable baby and very, attractive, beautiful family by his side. He gives somewhat, a uniting speech. He shows some humility. And then, to Aaron's point, loses his composure under Aiken, questioning him. And I will also say I used to work with David when I was at Global. He's not by any stretch a liberal plant or a liberal heckler. So I think it's particularly funny to paint Aiken that way, especially because I don't think the Pierre Poilievre camp actually thinks that he's a liberal heckler. They just said that because they could then, very easily turn that around into a fundraising appeal. And so I think this is less about, message discipline and more about, well, what do they actually want the message to be? And I think we may just need to accept that they may want the message to be that the media is not impartial, and that the media is in fact part of the enemy. And that's what we're seeing, at least from the rhetoric from Andrew Scheer, and it's been the rhetoric from from certain factions of the Conservative Party anyway for quite some time. And now it's just what the leader is doing. So he seems to be representing, the most vociferous part of the Conservative base.
Shannon, that approach, it obviously works in a leadership race among Conservatives. It works in fundraising, which, as was mentioned, an email was sent out right away saying that Aiken was more or less the media, and the way that he approached that scrum is how the media is going to approach Poilievre in the future. But is that kind of relationship sustainable for the next 2-3 years until the next election? Because eventually, these kinds of things start to filter out to everybody, and they see that kind of tone, that kind of rhetoric. It's not just the speeches. You do get also just this feeling about a guy in terms of how he's acting. It feels like he can't keep this up for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of sounding like the sports writer I used to be, like, complaining about the refs is sort of like the last preserve of someone who's not winning the game, right? And there was no need for him to turn to this kind of petulant, I think, sort of instinctive reaction. Like, it's like when a doctor hits your knee with a hammer and your leg goes up. Like, that is, to me, the impulse Pierre Poilievre was showing here. Like, to Supriya's point, if they're thinking about, message discipline or what is sort of their core message, I don't even think that's what he was doing. I think he just reacted out of gut. He has a long history, going back to the very beginning of his federal political career, of reacting very strongly to anyone who's against his team. He goes for the jugular. Like, a lot of his missteps earlier in his career, I think, in my opinion, turned on that kind of instinct, that if you are against, the Harper Conservatives in the early days, if you are a member of the Trudeau Liberals, you are in the enemy camp, and I will do anything to hack you off at the knees. And that's the instinct I saw on display there. I understand the principal point David Aiken thought he was making or was trying to make. I personally don't think it was a great choice, because it's now made the media one of the main characters for this week, which is just, we don't need to do that. We don't need to manufacture a ready-made attack ad about the liberal media. But by the same token, which party in this, dispute, if you will, has more to lose? I don't know if the public cares that much about, poo-poo liberal media. If that's an opinion you already hold, you're probably not going to be dissuaded from it. But if you're Pierre Poilievre, the newly crowned Conservative leader who came in with just a massive wave of support and did put on a really good showing on Saturday night, I thought he did quite a good job of threading the needle, of sounding more magnanimous, more mature, more appealing, presumably to swing voters, without sounding inauthentic to who he's been. And then you deflate that balloon by indulging that instinct to kind of like poke at someone with something as sort of, hacky and cheesy as liberal media. I think he's going to have to, or someone on his team is going to have to train him out of those sort of combative instincts. Just tamp it down. Like, you don't have to answer every heckle with a return heckle. Like, just let it go. Look a little statesmanlike. I know that's a very overworked word, but it's useful in this case.
I'm reminded a little bit, I know it's not even anywhere close to the same situation, but when Jagmeet Singh was heckled by someone saying racist things on multiple occasions. He handled himself pretty well. Poilievre did not really handle himself all that well. If you watch the clip, he did seem very flustered, very kind of frustrated about it, and understandably. But that knee-jerk reaction that he had in terms of just going after Aiken rather than just kind of trying to be the bigger person in the situation. Rising above, exactly. Like, when you think about some of the other times that he's had some issues over the campaign, the leadership campaign, when he was challenged during the debates, he often had a little bit of trouble dealing with that. And there was the time when he was getting a question about real estate things with him and his wife, and also didn't seem very comfortable there. But Aaron, when we are talking about this, are we just pearl clutching, no one's going to care, it's actually going to help him out, rile up the base, and everybody else is just not going to care about this whole thing?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sort of torn. I do think that there probably is sort of a basic median voter sort of impulse to not like conflict and not like the idea of politicians who sort of initiate conflict or cause conflict. And so it's possible that Poilievre suffers for that. At the same time, I don't know if he just needs to win, 35%, 40% of the vote. Maybe there are enough people who are either agree with him or are willing to sort of look past that combativeness with the media. But I think, as you said, to me, the display during that news conference or whatever we want to call it, he looked, as you say, I think he looked rattled. And I think that there's a downside to the way they have insulated him from the media and from sort of open forums, is that he's not ready for those moments. He looked brittle. He looked like he couldn't handle pushback. And I think, I don't want to play strategist, but if I was, I think, around his team, I'd be wondering about how he's going to hold up over the conflicts that are going to come from either news conferences or in the House or in leadership debates, because as much as Poilievre is talked about as a very talented politician and a talented sort of pugilist in the political sense, I don't know that we know that he can handle sort of tough questions and being hounded by the media and being attacked by other politicians. And the evidence from this week suggests that maybe he's not quite the political savant that he seems to be in most cases, because having questions shouted at you and the only thing you can kind of say in response is oh, it's a liberal heckler, while you're looking sort of nervous and rattled, doesn't suggest that he's completely comfortable up there. And I wonder at what point that becomes a problem for him.
Supriya, Aaron just mentioned what the team would think about. If you were in that team and trying to understand what their perspective is, do you think they're looking at these first couple of days as it didn't go well, or are they thinking, yep, going according to plan, got the people that we want against us lined up against us, and we've just raised a lot of money? Do you think that they are thinking that this went badly?
No, I don't think they think this went badly. I think this is part of the plan. I don't like, and so I agree with Aaron that he did look kind of rattled, right? I quite frankly, I think he looks weak in being unable to answer questions or being unable to, as Shannon put it, like rise above, right? But I'm not who they're trying to appeal to, and I think the folks that they're trying to appeal to are people that want a fighter. They want somebody who's going to stand there with a mug that says leftist tears and taking sips off of it. They want somebody to dunk on the libs at any sort of point. Like Pierre Poilievre and this party now represent the very online modern conservative movement, which is very much in your face. It is very combative. And it is very much like fuck your feelings sort of thing. And that is, I think, where we're going and where we're headed. And we're going to see probably a lot more of the, attacking of whether it's individual reporters or the media more generally. I think that's going to become a pretty stable feature in the discourse for the next couple of years, whenever the next election is.
What about, let's move on from that to what happened with Rayes and the text messages and the party apologizing from it. Shannon, I don't know what to make of that. Like it was obviously, it wasn't as if this was going to get Rayes to resign. It was just the only purpose this could have had was to try to flood his voicemails and more or less make things really bad for him on a personal level. It just, and it seems like the party agreed since they apologized for it. I don't know what that does. If you listen to the interview when Rayes was on Midi Info on Radio-Canada, he was followed right after by the new Quebec Lieutenant Pierre Poilievre. He seemed uncomfortable about it because this was him hearing about it for the first time, and even he was a little bit, it sounded off-put. So that feels like that might have been a misstep within the party, that some people might have been pretty upset about that.
Yeah, and I don't completely understand their sort of vague non-apology about it. Like, people have been joking, like, did their robo-dialing software become, like, self-aware and just freelance this? I'd also like to say, sort of glibly, but also sort of not. Like, maybe program your software so that if it's going to, like, auto send a text to someone whose name matches the name of the candidate or the former MP that you're trying to kneecap, maybe you just like X that one out of the program and don't send it, because there was just something ridiculous about the optics of that text message, right? That
his wife got it too.
Addressed to him, telling him to call himself and yell at him. It's also, I think maybe the most damaging part of that, but again, it's worth asking the question, who are they speaking to? Who's going to like it? Who's not? Is that it sounds like the Pierre Poilievre and company of the leadership race, as opposed to the more magnanimous, mature version of him once he sort of had the crown on his head on Saturday night. There was very much that feeling of, all through the last 6 months, you're with us or against us. There was a really vindictive streak, just kind of a take no prisoners. And that's why so many of the questions surrounding the kind of tone and the messaging after he won the leadership was about unity, because they had spent the last 6 months being really quite vicious toward other conservatives who were running against him. And that text message campaign to me sounded very much like that. Like, it was very much that tone. I mean, the point is, someone pressed go on that. Like, the system didn't send that itself. Someone had made a judgment call that was a thing to do. And to your point, Eric, it accomplishes nothing, but it's sort of like, it feels a bit like a meeting out of mob justice, right? Like, it's just it's putting someone on notice that if you speak up, you're going to hear about it. It's not, I mean, I know it's an overworked phrase, but it's not a good look to me. Like, they really, if you're Pierre Poilievre right now in this moment, when there's so much that's salient in kind of people's real lives and a policy space that is your bread and butter, economic issues, inflation, you have a chance to really have something to say, as opposed to just kind of flipping the bird at everyone. And I mean, I'm not a political strategist. I never have been. I hope never to be. But I think you want to really stay in that lane. Like, there is a profitable, useful, productive space for you right now. So why would you get distracted with, like, mean girls antics?
It almost had an element of doxing in a way, flood this guy's voicemail, there was no other purpose for it, it seems. And like, the idea that it is, I know when they said automated, they probably meant that it was sent to everybody or within the thing, rather than someone created it, because it quoted Pierre Poilievre's attack on Alain Rayes about not wanting to fight inflation. So clearly someone was listening to something and knew what words to put into that. But yeah, Aaron, it just, it's not just us being, whoa, this is really bad. The party itself apologized, which is not something you see very often. So clearly they feel like they overstepped.
Yeah, to me, the only explanation, well, I guess there's two possible explanations. One is that that's just how they do business, that you're either a friend or a foe, and as soon as Alain Rayes declared himself to be a foe, they, nuked him. Because that's just sort of how they operate. The other thing I suspect is that it's an internal caucus management thing. It's if you're thinking of leaving, if you're thinking of crossing us, rest assured we will come after you. Sort of similar to what Shannon said. I think that's probably what they were aiming to do. But I suspect that, that the feedback from within the party was bad, and it wouldn't shock me if it was particularly bad amongst Quebec MPs for the Conservative caucus. And I suspect Poilievre is conscious of the fact that that's one of his potential weak points in caucus is the Quebec MPs, and So if they're apologizing, I suspect it's because they detect there was real pushback to what they did, and if they want to kind of keep everybody on board, they need to apologize for it and walk it back a bit. That said, I suspect it still holds that if you're the next MP who's thinking of jumping ship, they may not send a text message, but they'll find a different sledgehammer to come down on you with.
Let's move on. Aaron, I'll stick with you. So the Liberals came out this week with inflation measures, more support for lower income people, dental care, again, for people who have difficulty paying for dental care. They were planning to come out with this before the leadership race, but then the death of the Queen, co-opted that, or got that out of the way. So they put it out this week. And, Poilievre did talk a lot about inflation, and in his statement that he tried to make when he came out in the foyer was about how, he's been talking about inflation for all this time, and now the Prime Minister is finally getting to it. Aaron, do you think that this was the government's attempt to get into the conversation? Because they had been criticized that they hadn't had much to say about inflation up to now.
Which I think is true. I mean, I think this would have had more impact if they'd done it 4 months ago, say. There may be real policy considerations for not having done something like this earlier, right? You don't want to do anything that would potentially make inflation worse if you don't have to. So maybe you ride it out for a few months and see whether you absolutely have to take this step before you take it. But in the meantime, people have gotten very frustrated about inflation, and Trudeau's approval rating is down, and Poilievre has essentially beaten them to the rhetorical punch on this fight. And so they're kind of playing catch up at this point. And so there's not only a debate now about whether what they're doing is enough. There's also a debate about whether they should have done it sooner. And so they're a bit on their back foot at this point. Now, they've also started to, now that they have a Conservative leader to fight with, they've started to push back against some of his ideas and some of his proposals. But they're fighting from behind at this point, and they're going to have to, just to continue this boxing analogy to an absurd degree, they're going to have to fight themselves out of the corner at this point. They have to, both policy and rhetorically wise, they have to figure out how to get this discussion back on their own terms, because up till now they've been sort of pounded on it.
Supriya, do you think this was enough to get them going, or are they're still on the back foot?
I mean, I don't know. I guess maybe a little bit on the back foot, only because the Conservatives seem to be very good at pushing the inflation message when they're not at least talking about opting out of inflation by putting all of your savings into, crypto or Bitcoin or whatever the exact quote was. So in that respect, yeah, I guess. But look, I think we also have to acknowledge the fact that governments don't really control monetary policy, right? Like they don't. They control their own fiscal policy. So they can do things that can, tamp down on inflation, which is the government spending less. So less money into support, less money on infrastructure, fewer public sector employees, raising taxes, cutting public sector salaries, whatever it is. But that's what it comes down to. I know that at least one bank has come out, I think it's Scotiabank, that has very much criticized these measures, basically saying that it's going to make the problem worse. And I would imagine that the retort to that from the Liberal side of things is just simply that they're targeted in a way that it's not actually pouring gasoline on the fire. It's giving folks targeted relief when they need it. But, I don't think inflation is going to magically disappear overnight. We're going to be dealing with these effects for quite some time, and Canada is not the only country dealing with them, because a lot of these issues are intertwined with global factors, climate change, constraining supply chains, etc. So we're going to have to find a way to talk about this issue in a way where we're, not propagating falsehoods constantly in a way to just score partisan points. And I don't think we know how to do that as a country.
Well, a lot of the measures, the government injecting money, giving people money to do things, is obviously the kind of thing that can make inflation worse, but some of the other solutions, from the Conservatives, tax cuts, get rid of carbon tax, things like that, also injects more money that people can spend into the system, which also has the same problem with inflation. So it does seem like, Shannon, we're talking more about politics than policy here, right? So on that score, if we're just talking about politics, who won this week in terms of this inflation discussion?
Well, it strikes me like we're all talking about the same thing, which is that one of the best things the Liberal government in particular could do right now is just talk to us. If there's a reason you didn't do anything about this 4 months ago because there were solid policy reasons, you could explain that. We're all grown-ups. We'd probably listen. If there's a reason that you designed these in this particular way, then also talk to us about that. Like, to me, that is their biggest problem right now, is that you ask them a pragmatic question and you get back a values answer. Why did you do X or Y? Why didn't you do X or Y 3 months ago? Well, it is very important to us to support the blah-de-blah. Like, that's not an answer.
Middle class jobs, yeah.
100%. Like, it's not, like, don't read me a bumper sticker and tell me it's an answer to a question. And I don't mean me personally. Like, if there are, and that's also, if we're going to be a little bit more mercenary and kind of politicking about it, that's also sort of a high ground they could assume for themselves. Well, listen, we're the governing party right now. We are privy to some complexities. We have our hands on some levers that, this guy over here, the leader of the opposition, does not, because we are actually in charge right now. So here is how we're thinking about this. Like, I truly, I don't mean to be naive. I know that my kind, our kind, we always want more answers, more disclosure. But I have a hard time seeing a lot of downside to that. If they would just articulate what they're doing, walk through their thinking, you can then, critique that or interrogate it. But you could already see this week, I thought Poilievre was having a very hard time finding solid ground. And maybe it was just that he was a bit off his game in general to critique the Liberals' measures, because he was sort of saying, on one hand, it's a drop in the bucket, it won't do anything. He sort of walked out the math, as he really likes to do, which was sensible enough, talking about the rent benefit, the $500 kind of top up to rent benefit, and then saying that would be less than a day's rent in a city like Toronto. Fair enough. So his argument there is it's a drop in the bucket, it won't help people. But then in the very next breath, but it's going to be a bellows on the fire of inflation. Like, you're going to have to pick one here. Is it going to make things worse? Or is it ineffective? And I think there's probably room for intelligent argument in different ways there. But if you're the Liberal government, I think your best kind of rebuttal to that is to just talk through your thinking. I would really enjoy that. I would really enjoy grown-up conversations and real answers that we could then actually debate, as opposed to filling in the blanks.
Aaron, do we know how to talk about this?
Yeah, I was going to say, I might dispute Shannon's argument that we're all grown-ups here. But look, I think both Supriya and Shannon are right. I do think there is lots of logic and rational discussion to be had here about what governments can and cannot do, and what's causing inflation and what will and will not solve it. I think the problem is that the Liberal answer for the last several months has been, well, we're doing childcare, so that'll we're saving people money. So like it was so kind of divorced from what was going on. And even the Prime Minister's speech to caucus, where he had a line about, there was something like, we have to be honest with, we have to face up that lots of people are going through a tough time. And to me, I think that's the first time I've heard him say that in the last 6 months. And they just didn't seem to have a message. And they didn't even seem to be kind of trying to find an argument on inflation. They would say it was a global problem. They would say that they were doing childcare, but they didn't really have an argument about inflation. And, so there's just sort of now coming around to it. And it helps that Poilievre is there as a counterpoint, because they can say, well, investing in Bitcoin isn't going to solve the problem. And, and cutting the deficit is going to have, his complaints about the spending we did during the pandemic is problematic for X, Y, and Z. So it helps to have a counterpoint now for them. But again, I just think they could have had an adult discussion, or tried to have an adult discussion, and they kind of skipped that step, and they're sort of just now getting to it.
Supriya, what do you think? The NDP quickly to claim credit for it. First of all, is there enough here that they want to claim credit for it? But also, what do you make of just the NDP trying to elbow itself into the conversation here?
Good for them. Weed your way into the conversation however you can, box them out, get a good drop step in, and go to the hoop. I mean, look, I think this was expected in terms of
so much sports today.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. Just in terms of like them, I think it was expected that they were going to try and take credit for it, and maybe they do deserve a lot of credit for it. Who knows? But to the point that Shannon was making with respect to Pierre Poilievre saying that it wasn't really going to help a whole ton, particularly when it came to that rent top up. I mean, that's quite true. If you're in a city, not just like Toronto, but in a lot of cities, right, across the country, $500 as a one-time top-up isn't a whole significant ton of relief for you. So it's interesting that the NDP would want its name on that, but they've got to inject themselves into it a little bit because they have been sitting on the sidelines, and I'm sure that there's at least some questions within NDP, higher ups about what 2025 actually does. I'm saying 2025, but whenever the next federal election is, what that actually, ends up looking like, and if Jagmeet is the guy to lead them into that, right? So, like, he's got to do what he's got to do right now, and that I think from just a pure, like, news cycle perspective, that is to say that, yeah, we did that. That's on us.
We heard during the Conservative leadership event, that the agreement between the Liberals and the NDP was called an unholy alliance. That it's Jagmeet Singh that's actually running this government. Shannon, are we seeing the tyranny of the New Democrats in these new policies by the government?
Well, I mean, we have seen like several of those pieces are from the NDP platform in one way or another. So it's fair enough for them to point to it and say some of it's our idea. I don't feel like they've been a very effective part of this whole conversation, considering that the whole issue of, inflation, ordinary people being able to afford their lives, the issues of inequality that were really highlighted quite viscerally out of the pandemic, that should be sort of their natural home. I just personally don't feel like they've been an effective enough part of the public conversation in something that should be in their natural wheelhouse. And now, how you had Jagmeet Singh saying yesterday that, it's sort of a tentative yes, they're going to continue to work with the Liberals. And there's this kind of or else to his statement, but I'm not sure I see the teeth to it, or at least he hasn't seen fit to say it. So there's a feeling of like, you don't want to be the NDP in this arrangement and look like you're strapped into the sidecar of someone's motorcycle, right? Because then you're not going to get any credit for the good things that are accomplished, and you're not going to be taken seriously as the party that's holding their feet to the fire. And I just think they might be at risk for being sort of ineffectual sidekicks here. I don't know if that's unfair. I'm willing to consider that it might be, but I feel like the NDP, and particularly Jagmeet Singh's messaging, what he's been talking about, and literally the lines he's been saying, have been so thoroughly unchanged for, I think, going back to the 2019 election. And that's a problem if we're in a different moment. Because it really is a moment that they should be able to speak to. I mean, maybe we're taking aim too strongly at them, and we're sort of trying to even out our attention to the different parties. But I think the inflation issue is it's sort of liability for the Liberals more rhetorically, I think, than policy-wise, because as we've all flicked at, there are lots of complicated reasons why inflation is happening. And, if you're talented at explaining things, you could kind of unpack those in a way that you hope the public will digest. But because this government has already been in power for 7 years, and they have a sort of institutional character of often looking out of touch on other issues, to be fair, like very separate issues. But I think that can easily shade into a feeling from ordinary Canadians of they don't get me. There's this sort of elitism gloss to them. Poilievre obviously is happy to get out the paintbrush and thicken that gloss. But I think, and when I think it was Aaron was mentioning Justin Trudeau talking about people feeling in pain and feeling stressed, and they should realize that expressing empathy is not the same thing as expressing responsibility. Like, to empathize with how people feel is not to say that you're culpable for it. I'm guessing that's sort of a red button of worry for an incumbent government when the economy's not going well. You can empathize with people without, I think, wearing that. Anyway.
No, that's an interesting point. Because it's true. If you're in the government, if you're admitting that things are bad, well, you've been the one running the ship for the last little while, so it must be your fault, right? So it is a delicate kind of thing to do, to both kind of take responsibility, but also take accountability for it and be like, we're going to help solve this and all that. So it feels like, and we'll finish on this and we'll go around the group, but it feels like this is going to be an interesting fall for politics, right? Because all of the parties are trying to figure out how to talk about inflation, how to deal with this issue. You have the Liberals who are now going to, one assumes, figure out how they're going to deal with Pierre Poilievre. You have the NDP trying to get into the conversation, pretending that they are willing to take the government down, which I don't think anybody really believes that they're anywhere close to doing. And then you have Poilievre and the kind of unpredictability of, like, this week went really strangely. This was a weird week for Pierre Poilievre, and it's week one. Like, we're talking about the rest of the fall, how that's going to go. Aaron, I'm not sure if, what can we say? How are the next few months going to go?
I think interesting is the right word. I think, I think in Poilievre and Trudeau, you've got two very talented in different ways politicians and two more engaging and sort of entertaining characters than you've had recently in Canadian politics. And you've got a real clash of visions at this point in how things should go, and that clash of visions is going to be had over some pretty difficult issues, and that should make for an interesting debate. I think, there's sort of the two main characters in this are dealing with pretty different challenges. One is, Poilievre trying to figure out who he should be and how he should be and how that's going to be handled by the public. And then I think you've got Trudeau, who I think at this point kind of needs to justify his continued leadership. He's obviously, or seems to have decided, he wants to face another election. I wouldn't say that's guaranteed that he's going to face another election, because I think at this point, with his numbers where they are, he needs to kind of show some signs of life, and that he's ready to take on Poilievre and can do it. And so the characters and the policy issues and the politics are all kind of colliding at this point. And I think, this fall is kind of the first chapter of what could be a pretty dynamic next few years, I guess.
Yeah, next few years. Supriya, if this survives until 2025, I'm already exhausted to think about how this is going to be for the next 3 years.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be good. I like, interesting is one way to put it. I would just say bad. It's going to be bad. We're going to see increasingly vitriolic rhetoric. We're going to see an increasing willingness to push demonstrably false information into the main public debate on key issues. We're going to see a lot of blaming and finger pointing, and I don't think folks will be getting the kind of response that a responsible government and opposition should be delivering for people at this time. And I think we have a coordinated sort of a few proxy outlets for the Conservatives right now that tend to work in tandem with pushing out a lot of their messaging and gaming algorithms so that certain information appears on people's feeds, and then they get further interact with those and get further, into a sort of algorithmic sort of rabbit hole. And I think all of it is bad. And I hate to be such a cheery, person on a Thursday morning, but I don't see this going any other way unless there's an actual willingness to do things differently. And I don't think there is a willingness to do things differently. And I think this isn't a bug. This is very much a feature of where our politics are right now.
Shannon, are you able to end us on a higher note, or are you feeling as pessimistic, as reasonably pessimistic, I would say, as Supriya does?
Well, strangely, I sort of agree with both Supriya and Aaron. I was saying on a panel last night, I kind of like the moment we're at. It's felt to me like we've been sort of stuck in purgatory for months and months and months, maybe even since last year's election. The Liberals have felt like they were sleepwalking. The Tories have been engaged in infighting. And now all of that has sort of settled. You know, we seem to be out of the pandemic moment for good in some way, knock on my desk here. And the Tories have picked their leader. And so it's sort of like the table is set. This is the team you're going to battle with. Both Trudeau and Poilievre and their parties are presenting their opponents as like an existential threat to the country. And you kind of have these two very talented politicians also at bookends of their career. It's easy to forget how long Trudeau has been around and that he's the old man in the room now because he just sort of presents as eternally sort of youthful. But his image has tarnished considerably and that of his party, but people are sort of wondering if he still has his fastball. Poilievre has been incredibly talented, but, you know, problematic, combative, all the way through his career. And now he's in charge of this party that he sort of remade in his own image. And I kind of like the clarity of that. I mean, it's going to be probably pretty ruthless, pretty brutal, but because we have real problems to solve in this country, I kind of like the fact that like these guys are there. Like, what do you got for us? Like, if we're your public, what do you have on offer to solve these hideous problems? Stop telling us it's the other guy's fault. Like, let's do this. I just think like no more messing around, no more moving the food around on our plates. Like, let's see. However long it lasts until the next election, you kind of hope this energizes everyone. But to Supriya's point, whether that's in a productive direction or a dysfunctional one, like anyone's guess. But at least like we're good to go now.
That's oddly optimistic about how bad everything is going to be, but
Yes.
you know, that's good. I think I'm more on Supriya's side. Maybe I'd watch this on HBO, but I'm not sure I want to live it. So it's so anyway, so that's great. So thanks everybody for giving your thoughts. We can take the optimistic, the pessimistic side. I'm not sure which way the world is trending, but we'll see. So thanks so much, all three of you, and looking forward to the next time we can chat.
Thanks.
Thanks, Eric.